It wants to know itself in all possible ways. Now, when it's imagining all of this, it is knowing all of this from its own perspective, from its unbounded perspective. It doesn't know what it is like to see from those limited perspectives. So the unbounded absolute knows from infinite perspective, but doesn't know itself from a limited perspective. And that is where manifestation starts.
Welcome to Mind the Shift. My name is Anders Bolling. I'm your host. My guest today, my distinguished guest today, in this episode is Dr. Tony Nader. He's a medical doctor and he has a PhD in neuroscience, trained at Harvard and MIT. He's a globally recognized Vedic scholar, and as Maharishi Mahesh Yogi's successor, he is head of the international Transcendental Meditation centers in over 100 countries. And he has recently come out with this book here. See if you can see it on the camera. One Unbounded Ocean of Consciousness. I have it on my iPad here. Welcome to the podcast, Tony Nader.
Thank you, Anders. It's wonderful to be with you.
I hope I got that little resume correct.
Perfect. It's perfect.
Thank you. So I want to hear more about you and your life journey, of course, but I'd like to begin right at the core of this, the topic of today, and it's the topic, one might say, in many ways. This book is about how it all works, really, and that's a tall order. But I have a soft spot for the big questions, and so much in this book resonates with the way I myself see the world, the universe, and life, and things I have scribbled down also myself, but not as coherent as you have done it, of course. Many spiritual teachers and spiritually oriented scientists, as well as philosophers, they have said that the only thing we can really know for sure is that we are conscious. Consciousness is real, and what else there is up for debate in many ways, like matter, because we experience what is called qualia. We have sense perceptions, we have feelings and thoughts, but in your view, what is then? This is counterintuitive to many people because they have been conditioned to see the world as basically material, and then the other things are a bit woo-woo. But what is matter in your view, and what is the relationship between consciousness and matter?
It's wonderful again to be with you, and more interesting when you hear this introduction, which shows your depth of understanding and interest, because we live our life through our sensory experience of what the world is like. And in historical terms, this sensory experience has been usually considered as fact that is unquestionable. And from there, we have conclusions and analysis and study of ourself, our environment, our reality in this universe. And it turns out, as history shows and as knowledge, even in more recent years, has demonstrated, that our senses only give us a certain aspect of what reality is. On the simplest level of historical development, if you say the sun moves from east to west, then you imagine the earth is flat and not moving, and it's the actually movement of the stars and the planets. So this is what the senses tell us. but it doesn't add up in terms of their movement and the planet's movements, which appears to be as if back and forth, and also the whole study of and analysis of the planetary bodies through telescopes, etc. Of course, that takes us back to Copernicus and Galileo. And then that showed us that it is the Earth turning around its axis. It's not the sun turning, around the center of the universe, which was supposed to be the Earth. So these are some aspects of starting to say that what we see as reality can be different in different levels of consideration and understanding. Now, as we go along, many aspects of this came to be more and more discarded as only impressions of our nervous system. And not to make too long a story, we go to even the one thing that in today's life we absolutely think is completely fixed, which is time and space, for example.
Yeah, I was going to ask about that too.
So we have a distance between us, we have time in which things happen, and our universe, our world, our internal conception is that all of these are fixed. We see objects, we say they are fixed, they are there. Everything is like billiard balls, atoms joining together to form molecules, and then molecules coming together to form objects that are localized in time and in space. Now, with general and special relativity, it was very well demonstrated that these also are relative, which means it depends on the observer. It depends on the speed of the observer and on other aspects. So that you have all these conundrums in how to understand reality from a profound way. It's not, I'm sure, the purpose of the discussion with you to go into the physics of things, but if we go
to some extent, but we don't have to go that deep, of course. But to mention
we can mention a few things just to dismantle the sense of assurance that the world is as we see it. And that is something that we always refer to, and that is why things that can be of a nature of about consciousness, about impressions, about perception, about the non-reality of the physical world as far as the definition of reality comes from our perception, is important. Because otherwise we cannot understand why thinking or a theory of the primacy of consciousness is tenable, is understandable. So we have to use the tools of actually physics to see where physics has led us in terms of understanding what the physical reality is indeed, because that's your question. What's the relation between matter and consciousness? So we have to define what is matter and what is consciousness. Consciousness, as you said, is something we all experience. Without it, we cannot feel love, we cannot feel joy or happiness, we cannot understand, we cannot be discussing today. Imagine just somebody without consciousness under anesthesia or in coma. Nothing exists for them. So consciousness is primordial, plays an important role. On the other hand, we see that there is also the physical reality, the physical aspect of reality, which we are so sure is as our senses and our experience give us. And then as we go deeper into what is matter made of, we go from the definition of atoms during the Greeks, that which is indivisible. So as if you take any object and you divide it into pieces, and at the end you reach a point where you cannot divide it anymore. And let's call this the primary constituent. So there is something primary that builds up, adds up with collection of parts, and then depending on how complex it is and how symmetrical or organized it is, it creates plants or humans, animals, planets, whatever, objects. So that is the objective world, the level of objects. Now,
So
scientists
you wouldn't say that it's an illusion, the material world. It's just a different way of expressing.
It is, it is it is one thing we see, we experience. Of course, it's real. It's very real. But what is its ultimate reality? What is it made of? And so you go to the atom, and then you go deeper, as scientists did, and they found that the atom itself is made out of more elementary particles. And then it was discovered in a very, very systematic and very scientific way that whatever we call elementary particles are fluctuations of fields. A field is like you see me, I see you. It's because there are photons that travel, but these photons are waves in a field of electromagnetism that come and come to my eye. So between you and me, there is more than just nothingness. There is actually fields. There are fields. If you take two magnets, you put them one next to the other, they attract each other or they repulse each other. And that is the electromagnetic field. It's a field like an ocean, and it has its waves, and these waves interact with each other to either produce one effect or the other, one force, one kind of force or the other. So the scientists have discovered that as you go deeper in nature, you lose that locality sense of local value of objects. And they become more and more spread out fields that fluctuate with each other and interact with each other on that level. Now, more and more going deeper into science, now there is a theory of what we call the unified field, which means that everything ultimately comes from one field, and that field interacts with itself, fluctuates, and then creates waves, like the ocean creates waves. But then these waves move and adjust and move with each other. They start creating forms, they create structure. And then these structures appear as objects. And the more complex these structures are, and the more they're connected together in special ways, they create nervous systems and humans and whatever we see in the universe. So the ultimate reality is non-local, which means there is fields that are potentialities, and they have probability, they have uncertainty, and they have action at a distance, which scientists call entanglement. And they are relative if you look at them from even the cosmic level, time and space and all of that. So we don't need to go more into this. It's just to lay the foundation of the idea, which is more than an idea, which is actually the reality, that what we see, what we experience through our senses is only one aspect of the true nature of things.
Yeah.
And so it is real, but is it only one aspect of the true nature of things?
And at the core of matter, it is, there are no, matter is at the core of things, at the base of things, not really matter. It's as you say, fluctuations, energy vortices, perhaps you can say. So everything is just energy. Is that a correct way of
yes, we can say from a physicalist point of view. Physicalist means if you believe that everything is ultimately physical, it is clear now that matter is physical and that physical is energy. And energy are fields, and fields are more and more unified. And there is the potential of one unified field, just one field that actually appears as many, like an ocean, creating waves, and the waves appear as different and many, but there's all the ocean. It's all fluctuations of the ocean.
That's a beautiful analogy, and many have used that, not least Alan Watts and other philosophers. I love that. And this unified field is also the reason why we are all one. Wouldn't you say? That we are all one. Not just that human beings are connected, because I think many people have an inkling, even if they are materialistically, inclined, or they have been conditioned to believe in a materialist world, they have an inkling that they are connected to other human beings. But you are saying in this book and also here that not only humans are connected, but everything is connected. I mean, I'm connected to this chair that I'm sitting on, and the lamp here, and the ceiling, and the sun out there. Is that true?
And the Andromeda Galaxy.
And the Andromeda Galaxy.
And everything else. Yes, absolutely. It's like a sheath, if you like. And in that sheath, you create structures by folding parts of the sheath. But when you fold one part, you are actually moving the entire sheath, the entire, cloth, if you like. And it is influence. Now, locally, influence is a little more than as a distance, but everything is completely interconnected. Everything is completely interconnected. Now, this is a view from physics. It's not anymore kind of hopeful, wishful, esoteric kind of thinking. We are just starting to understand how the universe is and its foundation and what is the ultimate reality. So I'm saying this not to use this as a proof of the fact that consciousness is all there is, which is something I will come to, but just to say that at the beginning, when we look at matter, at the physical, we find that it is not what we think it is. For example, you look at a red apple, and you say, well, or a tomato, and you say, it's red. It is red in itself. But redness is just a wavelength of light that is not absorbed actually by the tomato, that is reflected, and that comes to our eyes, and our eyes interpret this, our brain, as being red. So red is just a wavelength of light. It's 700 nanometer lengths of wavelengths. And so actually redness, you can say, doesn't exist as such in the universe. It is our eyes, our perception that sees red. So therefore, red is a way of perceiving 700 nanometer wavelengths of electromagnetic light.
Yeah.
Now, if you are colorblind, you will not see red, or you will not see green, or whatever, depending on the kind of colorblindness.
Yeah, that's the normal way of being colorblind, I think, red, green.
Yeah, and if some are, for example, animals don't see colors at all, or some even species don't have sight, then they'll see through different or experience different things from a different perspective. Or there are animals that experience the magnetic field rather than the electric part of the electromagnetic field. And so they'll perceive things from a different way. What this tells us is that we should realize, when we're looking for ultimate reality, that our senses are only giving us a part of the story, a small part of the story, which is very useful, very functional. We have to agree on something. We have to live in the universe. So it's absolutely useful. It's not that we are saying it doesn't help. To the contrary, evolutionary, it has led us to, certain things that we see in a certain way. And this is how we function in our society. And we don't live in an illusion. Only we live in a reality that is proper to our own analysis and perception.
But it could be useful perhaps to our development, spiritual development, maybe, to see that this is not the whole reality, the entire reality.
Exactly. It's exactly like that. So what is the ultimate reality then? Because this is the main question when we come to what is the relationship between consciousness and the physical. And this has been a question in philosophy and science for all times, and more recently it's coming back into the debate. And here you have two possibilities: either the dualistic possibility, which has been set in a beautiful way by Descartes, who said, as you expressed it actually, that if there is a demon that is making everything outside, making fun of me and what I see and what I hear, because at that time and since all time, they had experiences of maybe using drugs or feeling tired or getting hallucination, or the experience of dream, where in your dream you think the thing is absolutely real. If a tiger is jumping on you in the dream, you can get heart attack. So there is no tiger. When you wake up, it's gone. Yet your brain creates that tiger. So the scientists and the philosophers have analyzed all of this, and they've said, what if I'm dreaming? What if all of this is a dream? And actually today there are many philosophers with whom I've had also discussions that actually calls it a hallucination, that the universe is a hallucination, or it's a shared dream of which we agree on certain things, but it's a dream. And this is very real, because it's just, we decided, because we see things in the same way, because we have the same nervous system, that things are like that, tomatoes are red, or, apples can be red or yellow or whatever, yellowish or something. And this is an agreed on reality. So the question has been, okay, what if all of this is a dream, and a kind of dream, a shared, understood, useful, practical dream, but still it's not the ultimate reality. So what can I be sure of? I can only be sure that I am the one who is dreaming, that I have a reality of a conscious being. So my consciousness is experiencing something, and that's why I can be sure that I exist, that it's everything can be bizarre and different than what I think, but I think that I exist because I am conscious. And that's what Descartes said in his saying, I think, therefore I am. Actually, he meant I'm conscious, therefore I am.
Yes, that's what he actually meant, I think,
Yeah, cogito ergo sum. So that is, but then he cannot ignore the outer, as we're saying. The outer also exists, and therefore that comes to the dualist perception that there are two possibilities, two realities even. One is of consciousness, and one is of matter. Now, the problem arises is how these two interact with each other. How can something non-material influence something material, or the other way around?
Yeah.
And so you get into the science field, and most scientists, they say, look, I can take this object, I can throw it, it creates, it breaks. If I pinch you, you feel pain. It's a physical activity. Therefore, the physical is definitely real. And in this case, if I cannot find a solution of how the non-physical interacts with the physical, I'm going to decide that everything is actually physical, and consciousness is only an emergent quality in the physical, something that comes out of the complex structuring and interaction
in a mysterious way, and nobody has even come close to finding in what neuron that emerges.
Exactly, what neuron or sets of neurons or particles or even quantum mechanics, we don't know. It's how can this subjective experience that you express as qualia come from this objective world and material reality that is only apparently mechanical. But still, the dogma is that the physical is absolutely existing. It's absolutely there. We can't get rid of it. And therefore, if we want to find a monistic view, which means a view that has only one starting point rather than two separate realities, then let's make it the physical, and then have to explain how the physical leads to consciousness. And as you said, we are nowhere near even a theory that could even come close to explaining how this happens. So that is one point of view. Now, if you look at the data, you look at the realities on all levels, on ontology, epistemology, on ethics, on questions even in physics and relations and life and living and meaning of life, and look at the big thing, you have many unexplained factors. Why there is suffering, why there is pain, why there is sin, How does consciousness emerge from this? Why do we make decisions and choices that take us into different directions? And so this physicalist point of view, that's what we call it. They used to call it materialist, but matter is localized, and then the matter is discovered to be energy, and energy is just more fluctuations and physical things. So we don't talk anymore about materialist perspective. Also, it has some, connotation on economy and politics. But then the physicalist view is that everything is starting with some energy. It's physical energy, and that energy, now, as we said, could potentially create consciousness. Now, there is much more outlandish looking theory or idea that comes from ancient thinkers also, starting from even Vedanta, which is the ancient Vedic Indian knowledge, that actually consciousness is primary, and it is consciousness that appears as matter. This has been picked up in many different ways with different logics by what we call the idealists. The idealist means those who think that ideas are primary and then the physical is secondary. There are also the panpsychists who think that everything
is conscious.
Right, everything is conscious, but most panpsychists, when you dive deep into their idea, is that they are also almost dualists, which means they think consciousness is inherent in every aspect of nature, even from the atoms on, but there is some other thing that is being conscious. Whereas if you take the idealists, they will tell you, no, everything is consciousness, not everything has consciousness.
I had Bernardo Kastrup on the show a while ago, and he said exactly that everything is in consciousness. It doesn't mean that everything is conscious.
Right. Yeah, I've had a very nice discussion with Bernardo also on another occasion. Yeah, it was wonderful. Just was about 2 hours almost.
He's great. Yeah.
So now the question is, and how does then, if you take the other side of the story, which is that consciousness is primary, how does then consciousness appear as matter? And this is where, while discussing with Bernardo, he said that it's a matter of fact. We know because we see diversity. So it's like what they call in philosophy a brute fact. It's like you admit it because it's there. Now, this is not satisfactory enough in terms of explanatory power to say why it happens, where does it lead to, why it exists, how does it multiply itself, why was one become many. And so, I was saying that many philosophers, Plato, Leibniz, Spinoza certainly, and others have been saying that there is consciousness as primary. But what has not been elaborated is how does this consciousness become objects and get seen as objects, and how does it multiply itself into number?
Now, please tell us. I want to know this.
Yeah, this has been my search, my lifetime kind of search into ultimate reality, and I worked with Maharishi Mahesh Yogi, who is the teacher of Transcendental Meditation, who comes from that tradition, the Vedic Vedantic tradition, and he has spread transcending throughout the world. And he said something very profound, and that is that consciousness, if it is consciousness, which is non-material reality, it has a quality, and that is to be conscious. So what is its nature? Its nature is to be conscious. When you say, I am conscious, you are already creating 3 flavors within consciousness. And these flavors are the subject who is conscious, because there must be somebody or something that is conscious, and that is the subject. And there is the object of consciousness, because when you say consciousness, it is a reflective entity, which means an entity that reflects on itself. Otherwise, why would you call it consciousness? You know, you can call it the will, like Schopenhauer also imagined that there is something idealist like this. And he called it the will because he wanted to say that there is a power in it to drive it forth. So the power to drive it. So he called it the will. We're calling it consciousness for a reason, because its nature is to be conscious. Now, to be conscious, if you imagine as a human being, what is it to be conscious? Is to be conscious of something. You know, otherwise, why you're saying consciousness if it's just a flat something? So
one-dimensional thing, yeah.
Exactly. So when you say you're conscious of something, and in this case there is nothing else other than yourself, it means you are reflecting on yourself. There is a kind of an introspection, looking at your own self. Now, when you look at your own self, because not to get lost, let's go back to, let's say, the time when there was nothing that existed, absolutely nothing except consciousness, because we're saying we have to start somewhere. And there is a consciousness. Consciousness, it's not physical, it's not material, therefore you cannot look at it from the perspective of time and space. There is no time, no space, just a flat, absolute, pure consciousness. Now, this consciousness, what is it conscious of? Why we're calling it consciousness? It's conscious of itself.
Yeah.
There was nothing else.
That's true.
So being conscious of itself, there are three aspects that emerge. The aspect of the one being conscious, let's call that the observer. There is the aspect of the object of consciousness, that which one is conscious of. And there must be a process that connects the observer to the observed. Because if you're sitting in a room and there is a flower, but it's dark, you are a conscious observer, and there is an object, but you're not connected to that object. Therefore, without the connection, you're not conscious of the object. So to be conscious of something, there must be a process that connects the observer to the observed. And so these are the three flavors in the reality of consciousness that are inherent within it already. Now, we call the observer a silent observer because the observer is just like a witness. We call the process a dynamic process, which means as if the observer comes out of itself or themselves into a process of observing oneself as an object of one's own observation, which is then an object. And the object has the quality of hiding. It hides the observer and the observed in a sense. Why? Because let's say when you look at the flower and you're conscious of the flower, and you can try this, everybody, you realize that you forget yourself, and you don't put attention on the process of observing. It's the flower that takes over your consciousness, as if you become the flower.
Yeah, it's very difficult to determine, who is doing what there.
Exactly. The flower becomes in your awareness. It takes over your awareness. That's why we call it a hiding quality. So the object hides the observer and the process of observation, but they are real because without them, there is no conscious experience.
Isn't this what many say is what is happening when you wake up, when you're awake, spiritually awakened?
Yeah,
that you kind of lose your own self and you immerse yourself into everything that is around you.
What happens?
Stop thinking or whatever.
Yeah. Actually, this is very important, and that is really transcendence in a sense. With transcendental meditation, when you practice this technique, you go beyond the surface. So if the mind or consciousness is like the ocean, as we said, having its ripples on the surface, when you transcend, you go beyond the waves into the depths of the ocean, and you experience your true inner self. In fact, it's not that you leave the self, it's that you go to the inner self, which then is what we call the unified field. We started off, and that helps us in our analysis, because if everything is unified field, appearing as many things, now we have, as humans, the ability to experience all the range of experience from the surface levels, and then transcending, which means to go beyond the surface and actually experience the self, experience the true self. Because if the unified field is everything, that's ultimately our true inner self. But it's not a small self, a small ego. It's the self of everything and everyone.
Yeah.
And that's the transcendence.
Yes, I want to ask you about that. This is also big. It's everything is big, but nevertheless, it's big and small at the same time. It's natural. But we can come back to TM a bit later here. But in the book, you describe, speaking about the unified field, which I assume is the same thing as you call the absolute consciousness, also in the book.
Yes.
You describe existence as a journey of sorts from this all-encompassing absolute consciousness down to or into. Up and down is a difficult context to use, maybe concept to use in this context.
Analysis,
but
yes.
yeah, let's say it's down to the journey down from the absolute consciousness down into the maximum state of perceived separation, not separation per se, but perceived separation. And you call that the analysis
path, yes.
Path. And is that maybe also the same thing as entropy? We can come back to that. Then from there, you go, the soul, or whatever you want to call it, goes back up to the state of oneness, which you call synthesis. So how are we to understand this? Is this a constant dance of journey from the absolute to the total separation and back again? Is that how you would describe it? Or
yes, beautiful. You took us a few steps ahead, which is wonderful.
Okay.
If we go back to our basic oneness of being, experiencing itself with three flavors: the flavor of an observer, a process of observation, and an observed. Now we have the potentiality to have different proportions of silence, dynamism, and hiding. So that consciousness, this is how I see it in terms of how it's described in the book. That consciousness goes from 1 to 3, and the 3 are the subject, the object, and the process of observing, and into a multiple infinite number of possibilities of looking at itself from a big perspective as well as from a small perspective. Smallest perspective, bigger perspective, or tiny, tiny, tiny perspective. So tiny perspective is a very small amount of consciousness, and higher perspective is a large amount of consciousness. And infinite perspective is the perspective of the absolute, which is the perspective of pure consciousness. So since the nature of that one unbounded ocean is consciousness, its nature is to know itself, because that's what consciousness is, know itself from all possible perspectives. And so it undertakes that process, if you like, of like an imagination at the beginning. So how this brings us back to how unity divides into multiplicity, and yet remaining unity. It's still one ocean. It's still one ocean,
but it creates
anyways,
ripples and waves.
Ripples and waves. And they are still at this level unmanifest, non-manifest. This is where we separate. So we have relative and absolute. We have one and many. And also we will come to manifest and non-manifest. This we will come in a minute or two after we look into this. So yes. I usually like to take the example of fiction author who wants to write a book or wants to make a novel, fiction novel, fictitious or something like that. And so they have their imagination. We humans have imagination. We can imagine Apollo and Zeus, and we can imagine Thor, and we can imagine unicorns and things that don't exist. And we can imagine people with different characters, with different personalities, with different things. And that's how we usually create movies and books and stories that people enjoy to read and all of that. So we, with our consciousness, can imagine all kinds of things. Now, think of that infinite consciousness sitting within itself and actually imagining all possibilities. So that consciousness knows that there is nothing else but itself because it is there, but it also knows that it can see itself and imagine itself or imagine its content from an infinite number of ways. Just like the author thinking, how can I do, what am I going to create as a character in my movie and all of that.
I'm dabbling a little bit with short stories myself, so I know exactly what you're talking about.
Yeah, exactly.
You create a new world in your mind in a way.
Exactly. So that consciousness also, and much more than us, because it has vivid possibilities and infinite possibilities. The more creative the author is, the more they'll imagine things, and the more they'll fascinate people by their imagination. So if you have a much higher consciousness, in this case, infinite consciousness, you can actually imagine an infinite number of possibilities. Okay, so this is how from 1 to 3 to many, to infinite number of possibilities emerge in the, let's call it, imagination of that one consciousness sitting. Nothing has happened yet. There is no unicorn that appeared anywhere. There is no Anders, no Tony, no nothing, no shift the mind, nothing. But they're not existing yet, but they are in the imagination. So you are in that imagination. I am in that imagination. You are in that imagination when you were young, when you were old. You are also in that imagination when you are 1,000 years old. Well, how could that be? It's an imagination. You can create a movie where Anders lives 1,000 years, maybe 1,000,000 years, maybe immortal. Yeah, sure, you can. You can imagine that. And you can imagine anything. But they're not yet real. They're not yet existing. And why they're not existing? It's because they are seen from a perspective of the absolute as imaginations. And therefore, the absolute knows itself already. That's the first thing, the first impetus, the first power of multiplicity comes from knowing oneself. So we started with consciousness, and now we're saying consciousness knows itself to be one, to be three, and to be many potentialities. Yet all these many are there existing, each with its opposite at the same time, because it can imagine anything. You can imagine black or white or yellow or red. You can imagine all the colors together. You can imagine them contradicting. You can imagine plus and minus. You can imagine charges, forces, etc. And ultimately, all of them add up to a one unbounded ocean of just that consciousness. So there is everything and its opposite. And so when there is everything and its opposite, and when it is just all perceived from the perception of the absolute, then nothing is manifest yet. So although we have this infinite possibilities, none of them is yet manifest. Which means
how does it manifest?
Creation hasn't started. We are still in the imagination field. A field of the author. The author hasn't yet written the book. The book hasn't become a movie. So there are nothing that is play or a play on the stage or anything like that. So that is the first stage. Now, the question is why manifestation? Why is it that actually there is a big bang and then there are these things that happen? Before we go there, let's go back to the question about analysis and synthesis.
Yeah.
When you look at this infinite number of possibilities in terms of consciousness, you can look at them as either having higher consciousness, lower consciousness, lower consciousness, lower consciousness, lower consciousness. And that's all that there is in terms of what I'm calling analysis, which means we're starting with 1, and then you have 3, and then there start the process of hiding and manifesting and not manifesting and imagining from a broad perspective to imagining that there is almost no consciousness at all. So you can imagine a being that is very highly conscious. You can imagine a being that is less conscious and less conscious. And then you can imagine much less conscious. And then you can imagine almost no conscious at all. And that is the pyramid that I show in the book. And that is simply a way of putting these qualities, these layers and levels of consciousness that are potential in that field of consciousness. Now, how do we justify this? Well, look at our universe. Before, we haven't said yet how the universe emerges, but still look at our world. We can see there are beings like humans with higher consciousness. There are beings with lesser consciousness, animals, in the animal kingdom. There are, chimpanzees and, maybe dolphins, maybe whales and elephants and like that. And some have a sense of self, some don't have a sense of self. And you go into the hierarchy of the animal life, and you will see that you have some that are lesser and lesser and lesser consciousness. You get to a bacterium, it's probably much less consciousness. You come to a tree, it's less conscious than, an elephant. It's obvious, but it is still having some consciousness. And actually, even if you go down into the elementary levels of inorganic life, you can start saying that they are not, of course, conscious in any way like an animal or a human or even a plant, but they still sense and detect and respond to forces, for example, gravity or electromagnetism. And I am including these in the definition of consciousness. This is a very important point, because when we think of consciousness, we imagine that one has to be conscious like a human being.
Be aware of what.
Yeah, like a human being, conscious of the self, conscious of what will happen to me, of the future, conscious of the past, memory, conscious of, present, past, and future, conscious of history, conscious of like that, and emotions and feelings and reactions to this. And so one starts to try to give to other conscious beings the same qualities, and then it becomes ridiculous, because you can't tell that the stone has those emotions and feelings and expectations. It doesn't. Absolutely not, of course. Yet we cannot prevent it from having the ability to respond to gravity, for example. It doesn't have a choice. It doesn't have freedom. It doesn't have a decision making, but it senses gravity and it falls to the ground if you drop it.
And gravity is a part of, is an expression of consciousness.
It's part of the dynamics of consciousness, and an object that responds to that is conscious of that in a most meager, little, tiny way. Yeah. And that is very important. So we're expanding the definition of consciousness from a human-like consciousness to include all the animal life, the trees, and even any response, any sensing, any detecting. So this is where it's very important to realize that in order to understand the paradigm and the framework I am presenting. Mm-hmm. Otherwise, people say, this is crazy, you know, it's telling me that the stone is conscious. Of course, it's not conscious like you, but he's sensing gravity.
Mm-hmm. And if you have this concept of an all-encompassing absolute consciousness that is above everything, or it includes everything, then it's easier to understand that the stone is part of that grand consciousness, albeit not being an individual consciousness, so to speak.
Exactly. And so the range of consciousness, therefore, comes from almost nothing to an infinity of consciousness. That's how you get a pyramid, if you like. And this particulate level of consciousness is very, very tiny, and the higher consciousness is very, very expanded.
Okay? Is this? Yeah. Maybe you want to elaborate more.
I okay. Take your question. You're helping with your question.
Wonderful. Is this, would you say, the purpose of the universe, so to speak, to experience itself? It wants to experience itself in all the myriad ways that it can experience itself and express itself. And is this also then, by extension, the purpose of life for a human on Earth, for instance?
Beautiful. That's exactly a nice bridge to the manifestation.
Okay.
Why manifestation happens? If that infinite consciousness imagines everything, why would it then manifest as individual? How does manifestation happen? Why would it happen? What is its meaning? And this point that you raise is a key point. It wants to know itself by its nature, because that's its nature. Nature is consciousness, so it wants to be conscious. Conscious means to know. It's a different way of saying I know, I experience, I know myself. It wants to know itself in all possible ways. Now, when it's imagining all of this, it is knowing all of this from its own perspective, from its unbounded perspective. It doesn't know what it is like to see from those limited perspectives. So the unbounded absolute knows from infinite perspective, but doesn't know itself from a limited perspective. And that is where manifestation starts. It starts from the most limited perspective. So if you like the absolute, if you want to give it a storyline in terms of time and space, or in terms of time, which again we have to contradict because time and space is a different story. But in order to be able to talk about it and understand it, I'll put it in a context of time. So in the context of time, you imagine the absolute, okay, now sees itself, 1 becomes 3, and 3 become many, many, many. And then it goes into those finer and finer and finer, smaller conscious, imaginations of,
conscious agents, as Donald Hoffman
agents, yeah, exactly, conscious agents or conscious units or observers. And it gets there to the tiniest possible observer. Let's call it an elementary particle, an electron or something like that. It's just now imagining. And then it sees what is beyond that. It can keep going, or it can say nothingness. So the concept of nothingness emerges. The concept of nothingness is the concept of not being conscious. It's something that is inert, doesn't react to anything, doesn't feel anything, and doesn't have an existence, really. So that's a concept within the absolute.
But it can never be anything more than a concept.
It can never be more than a concept. Because
nothing is not an experience.
Exactly. It doesn't exist. It doesn't exist, simply. It cannot exist. But as a concept, it can exist. From there on will start actually the return back. And the return back, this is where it starts from that negation of nothingness that is actually doesn't. I've reached my limit,
point, yeah.
my imagination. Now what I want is, all right, let's try to see what it is like to experience from those limited perspectives. I'm stopping because it's an important point to think about. I know that these are potentialities, but what it is like to be in their shoes, what it is like to see reality from a small perspective, from a tiniest possible perspective, and then come back towards the bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger perspectives, and then come back to myself, which is the infinite perspective, the absolute perspective.
And somewhere along the line, humans exist.
Exactly. Somewhere along the line, as consciousness, as these fluctuations of tiny consciousness, and then we see this like in the Big Bang. You have the universe. It's actually like that. It starts from nothingness in a sense, and then explodes into fields and energy and forces, and then fluctuations. As it cools down, you start getting elementary particles, and then
it looks like matter eventually.
Exactly. And then it grows, it looks like matter, and then it grows again, and then consciousness rises and rises and rises, and reaches the complexity of a human dynamics, which then can know itself. This is where transcendence helps. It's by going back to the self, you can know that you are that unified field, that you are that original consciousness. And that is much higher consciousness. And then we can have higher and higher levels of consciousness, which we call, God consciousness, cosmic consciousness, and even unity consciousness. And so that is how the process happens. And all of this, what we live, what we go through, what creation is about, what manifestation is about, is just knowledge, to know from different perspectives. That is the force of life, and that's all actually that it's all about. Now, knowledge is discussed in different ways, but growing of the self, expanding the understanding of the self to come back to the ultimate reality is the purpose of life.
Yeah, beautiful. Now, in your book, your book is kind of it's spiritual, of course, but it's also scientific in nature. In some parts, almost a bit technical, but in a good way. And you talk about this absolute consciousness, the consciousness with capital C. I assume that is what many people in religious traditions would call God, isn't it?
Yes, but
you don't really like to talk about God in this context. Is it because it has so many connotations that lead the wrong way, so to speak?
Exactly. God is, in a sense, different perception of what God is are seen from different belief systems. And, it can be a God-loving being, a God-punishing being, a God temperamental, a God, jealous, or a God fair or unfair. And why does God create this? Responsibility goes back to God. God decides at every moment what happens. And you get into definitions that can be misleading. So consciousness is something that we have, that we are, that we experience, and we can extend the concept of consciousness as we have it, or the understanding of consciousness, to a bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger consciousness. Ultimately, we can imagine an infinite consciousness. Now, if one likes to call this God or a quality of God, then it's fine. In any case, whatever God is a conscious being. You can't have a God who is just a mechanical machine.
No.
So, and what is the consciousness of God? It must be extremely unlimited. No. So, you want to call it that, it's fine, but it's not within the definition of the simple, spontaneous paradigm of emergence and manifestation and balance. So, this is how we can see it.
Yeah, wonderful. Some people talk about the source. What do you say about that term?
Yeah, I don't know how they've defined the source, but this would be the source from my perspective.
The source. The absolute consciousness would be the source then.
Right.
Another question would be that you read and hear about sometimes, and I guess it is like that, but we can use I can ask the question anyway. Would you say that the universe is holographic? As above, so below, which what you're saying almost implies that everything goes from the highest to the lowest, and so that everything that you can see in the large, in the macrocosm, you can see in the microcosm as well, the same patterns.
Yeah, the possibilities are all there in the absolute, but what actually manifests depends on the dynamics of the manifestation, and this takes us to freedom and choice and decision making and determinism, which are big subjects of discussion.
Yeah,
and that takes us to the fact that if the object or if the conscious unit is to be able to be allowed to be itself, because what is its purpose? Its purpose is ultimate purpose. It's kind of holistic purpose. Ultimately, the reason why it exists, the existence, the essence of its existence, is to know from a specific perspective. Now, in order to know from a specific perspective, you have to allow that perspective to live its own reality and actually decide what it will do in its own point of view, from its own perspective. You cannot make it mechanical and have to follow a certain set of things, because otherwise you're not knowing it from its potentialities, from its true level. You would be just forcing it to be something, and then there is nothing to discover and nothing to really know. So this is where freedom becomes an important part of reality.
How free are humans in this reality?
We are free, but in order to maintain the wholeness of balance, because you cannot imbalance reality, there is one wholeness, and that wholeness has to maintain itself as the same as itself, because otherwise it would create something outside itself. It doesn't make sense. Where would it take, why would it create something outside of itself? It cannot. That makes it even an ontological problem. It has to be itself. And so if there is a plus that is created, you get a minus that is created. So that plus and minus are always leading to neutrality in a sense. So if you have positive energy, you create negative energy. And we know that the universe overall has zero energy if you calculate gravity and energy. This is another physics perspective, but we know that there is action and reaction. We know you cannot create a positive charge without a negative charge. So there is law and there is order. And then how can you accommodate in law and order freedom? What happens is manifestation happens within the constraints of time and space. Why? Because time and space are the values that will separate these entities one from the other. I hope I'm not going too technical, but it's explained in the book in a systematic way. In order to be able to know from a small perspective, that small perspective has to have some independence, some sense of existence on its own level, some sense of that. Otherwise, if it is left as part of the whole mechanical system, then it doesn't really allow you to know from its own perspective. To know from your own perspective, you have to be able to make a decision from your own perspective, to exist from your own perspective, to be your own perspective. And what do you need to do that? Since everything is interconnected, what you need is to separate, at least on the level of appreciation or perception, to separate one thing from the other. And that is where time and space come. Space is the ability to separate objects that can coexist at the same time. Time is that which separates objects that can coexist in the same space.
Yes, that's good. It's in the book, I know. Yeah, I never.
So if you take a chair,
like that, but it's a beautiful definition of time and space, actually.
If you take a chair, for example, just to explain, you take a chair. How many people can sit in a chair? Let's say only one person, of course. I mean, you can put people one on top of the other, but that's not the idea. It's just an analogy, a metaphor.
Yeah.
You have one space, you put one person in that space. Well, can you put 1,000 people in that space? Yes, but at different times.
Yeah, yeah.
So that helps us to understand that if you want to put 1,000 people, you have to separate them in space, and you have to have 1,000 chairs, which means 1,000 spaces.
Yeah. In that way, you can look at history as layers of happenings, really, that you can see. Because I mean, we in the Western world, we are conditioned to see history and time as some kind of timeline, which we are walking along, which is totally flawed, I think. But it's more like layers, because everything is happening, as you say, in the same space in a way, but at different times. So it's all on top of each other in layers, like an onion almost.
Exactly. And actually, when you look at the study of what time is in the universe, it's baffling. It's physics, and some people say it's crazy. It takes time for people to accept and understand the real reality of time, because what's happening in some galaxy could have happened, consider that it has happened yesterday. If I'm walking at a certain speed, if somebody is walking the other way, it would have happened tomorrow or in 10 days. Or
it's all over the place. I know.
And it's all mathematics. It's all physics. It's like the problem is not with the mathematics and the physics. The problem is with our concept of time flowing in a certain way and space being a certain thing. And so time and space are concepts that separate, that allow separation, as we have just discussed with the story of the chair. So when things happen in time and space, then you have freedom within time and space. And this is a very important distinction. You have freedom to do what you like, to choose if you have a certain level of consciousness. You can have a bigger choice possibility. If you have a lower level of consciousness, your possibilities are smaller. This is another point which we can come back to, but it becomes complicated. But let's say, just to go back to freedom, with higher consciousness means you know more, you see more, and therefore you have higher number of possibilities to choose from. And you can choose from all these different possibilities. Some of them might be helping to evolve, to grow in consciousness. Some of these choices might be negative and detrimental to you or the environment. And you can actually make the choices with freedom. Now you say, well, you said that everything is balanced. For every action, there is an opposite reaction. So how come you can talk about freedom if everything is counteracted? Well, of course, if you create a positive charge, you have to have a negative charge. This is physics. Otherwise, you have a problem with maintaining the balance of charge and neutrality in that area. But on the level of behavior, it is happening in space and time. So freedom is bound to space and time, which means you make a decision now. it is going to allow you to live the results of your decision, or to be able to make a change which can be negative or positive, but ultimately every action will have its reaction and will be balanced. But it will be balanced in due space and time. This is the difference.
And so, it might be that you in this lifetime will not be aware of the balancing act, so to speak, that
exactly
follows this.
Exactly. So our freedom is within space and time, but the infinite computer is computing automatically the reaction that will happen to your action. You know, that takes us into the...
That was called karma in the Indian...
Exactly. That is karma for every... And in modern physics, is for every action there is an equal and opposite reaction. We know that. Now, the opposite reaction on the level of behavior and higher levels of consciousness doesn't happen immediately in the physical space and time. Even though it is computed immediately, the reaction can take time to happen, and because of other factors that are influencing the action. But ultimately, there is what we can call infinite determinism. It's absolutely determined, yet there is freedom. So you live your freedom within a certain space and time, only to find out that you have to face the results of your action in the future. So this is how I resolve the problem of freedom with order and law and balance and determinism, and every action has its reaction. Otherwise, you know, you get into theories of compatibilism and all of this, which actually really don't hold logically, either philosophically or even scientifically.
These are beautiful insights, and how can these kinds of insights help people in their lives? It's also a big question, but I guess that's what your work is all about.
Well, there is a technology that comes with the knowledge, and that technology is a technology of consciousness. The way it helps people is to understand consciousness is primary, that the ultimate solution to the problems of the individual and society is not in the material world, it's in the consciousness, because consciousness is primary and consciousness is all there is. So if you want to stop war, it's in the consciousness of the people that you stop war, because the other is just instruments of this consciousness. The decision-making process, the relationships, how we build our world. The ultimate solution to the environment is not in the physical world. The ultimate solution to the environment is in the consciousness of those who are working on the environment, in the consciousness of those who are making the decisions about life and living and environment. For health, it's the consciousness that makes the decision about your food and diet and exercise. For relationship between nations, it is the consciousness of the people influencing the consciousness of the leaders that then make the decision to use what they call material and all of that, as if that is the solution. It's never the solution. It's never the arms. It's never the physical things. It's the consciousness that uses those and manipulates them, that put them to work, that create them and develop them, that is the most important thing. The rest, therefore, is secondary. So what is the solution? Raise consciousness. And we have a way to raise consciousness. Of course, you can raise consciousness through talking and understanding. This is one way we're doing with Anders and discussing it. So we can see what are the priorities and what are the essential ultimate reality of life. And when we find its consciousness, we can understand that we can do something about consciousness. But there is a technology of consciousness. This is why people now practice yoga and meditation and are, focusing on the importance of developing their awareness and understanding. And what we teach is Transcendental Meditation, which is the way to go back to the self, to the ultimate self, and therefore re-establish wholeness and fulfill the purpose of life, which is to grow in consciousness. So to grow in consciousness is the reason why we are here, to grow in knowledge, not only knowledge on a surface level of mathematics and physics and chemistry and all of that, but knowledge in terms of love and emotion and feeling, knowledge in terms of oneness with the other, so that the self grows to include everything. Ultimate knowledge is to know that we are everything, you are everything, everyone is everything, and therefore fear disappears and the sense of unity rises. On an intellectual level, it's great to discuss it, but the most important level is to live it in person. And that's why I promote and I highly encourage people to transcend, which means go beyond. You know, we said mind is like an ocean with surface waves. Transcending is going beyond the waves to the depths of the ocean. And there you have the power to control all the waves.
Yeah.
Make life better.
And fear is the opposite of love, I think. And I think many people are aware of meditation techniques today. There's a lot of talk about meditation, and not least my audience, I think, knows a bit about meditation. So can you tell us what is the main difference between this TM, the Transcendental Meditation, and other forms of meditation for those who don't know so much about these things?
Meditation is many things, you know, like some people would call our discussion a meditation because it's a contemplation, it's a thinking about a subject, thinking about one's life, being aware of things more. Some people will be more mindful of your breathing, have your ability to be mindful of the moment you are in, not just keep your mind jumping from one place to the other. And so you train yourself to be aware of breathing, to be aware of thoughts, but stay away from them. This is kind of different kinds of meditation. And there is transcending, which is not concentration, nor contemplation, nor trying to be mindful, but using the natural tendency of life to grow and expand towards higher consciousness, towards higher understanding. That's why we all feel we want more, we want to be more, to experience more. That is the tendency of life, and that is a tendency of our mind, which is always searching for more, searching for better experience, better taste, better sound, better music. All that is enriching. Now we use that tendency of the mind to go for more and direct it inwards. Usually we want more and more through our senses, more things to see, beautiful things to hear, to taste, etc. In Transcendental Meditation, we close the eyes and take that tendency of the mind and direct it inwards. And what happens is that the mind will naturally dive towards its own self, because that unified field we talked about from the beginning is more than the most, is actually more than anything. And so the mind looking for more, but always to the outside, suddenly has a chance to look inside, and it will get driven towards its own self by its own nature. That's why we say it's natural. You don't force or manipulate the mind. Of course, there will be stresses and strains, and have to deal with thoughts. This is why there is a course that tells you how to deal with different, situations during the practice. But that's basically the difference. It's not manipulating the mind or forcing it or contemplating on a subject or concentrating on anything. It's just allowing the natural tendency of the mind to take you towards yourself.
So it's an exploration of the universe, but inwards in a way.
Exactly. And what happens is, like you dive in the ocean, the waves are less and it settles down. The mind settles down. And since body and mind are intimately connected, they're actually an extension one of the other. The body rests very deeply. And as deep rest comes, stresses and strains and fatigue are removed, because that's a natural tendency of the body to get rid of anything that's foreign in it. And that's how you dive deep into the self and you rejuvenate the body. You strengthen your immune system, reduce blood pressure. And there are hundreds and hundreds of scientific research studies that show the beneficial effects from this simple technique that even children can practice on mental potential, on health, on behavior, and even on the effect in society, because we talked about collective consciousness.
Yeah. And I've heard before and read, and it's also in your book, I think, that groups of people who are practicing TM have been able to to diminish the level of crime in cities and even countries, perhaps. Can you tell us about the proof of that?
It's wonderful because there is a new research that has come, which is very systematic in terms of the numbers of people practicing TM and the advanced technique together, and its effects on crime and conflict and accidents of the roads. And the significance level is very, very high. See, as we say, we are all one and the ultimate true reality, but some are on the surface and others a little deeper, whatever. If we can enliven in the collective consciousness of society that deep level of feeling, so even those who don't practice transcendental meditation, they'll feel a more sense of calm and clarity, rather than in a society that is stressed and strained, and then people cannot see and cannot experience settled feelings. They feel tense. So there is that tension feeling, which leads the person, if they are weak or they have lots of stress, to action which is not in accordance with the best evolutionary power of life. And they commit crime and do the wrong things. But if the ambiance, the atmosphere, the collective feeling is more settled, then the people who are even weaker, they'll feel softer and they'll find solutions. And so we have seen a very, very clear correlation between the numbers of people practicing transcendental meditation and the behavior of on the social level by people who, have less accidents of the road, less conflicts, less crime, and like that, even on the environment, more balanced environment. So it's been repeatedly done, and that's why we are offering the world today that we can do a large experiment in which large groups of people can have an influence on the whole world, and we can see
how many does it take to have an effect on for instance, crime?
The studies have shown that for TM itself is 1% of the population, but for the advanced techniques that are taught, we have found square root of 1% is enough. So for the whole world population is less than 10,000, 8,000 people, but they have to be doing it in the same place at the same time to create that global effect. So we are now actively working on that and to show that we can make a difference from the level of consciousness rather than from the level of the surface value of action on the physical level.
Have you informed the politicians about this, the
yes,
ministers of the world?
We have been trying to inform. We have been sending messages, scientific research being done. And the problem has been that although the research is very, very accurate and has been even published in very serious peer-reviewed journals, the problem they have is the mechanics of it. How is it possible that from consciousness you can make a difference in the life of the people and the physical level? And that is why I am now promoting and this understanding that the physical level is only an expression of consciousness. And therefore, how can consciousness act on the physical? It's a problem. But how can consciousness act on consciousness? Then it's no problem. And since everything is an expression of consciousness, then from that level of consciousness, you can change the collective awareness, and then the behavior will change and the decisions will be better and life will be much healthier.
Yes, I'm convinced. Hopefully the rest of the world will become convinced also eventually. I'm just going to ask you about your personal journey a little bit here, because you're now very deeply into TM, of course, because you have become this Maharishi Mahesh Yogi's successor in this movement. But my question is, were you already into profound meditation like TM or other kinds of meditation when you began your medical and scientific career? And if so, how did that affect your path through, the mainstream education and work?
Well, it helped me a lot. I was practicing TM when I started medical school, 1 year into medical school. And it helped me a lot to concentrate, to work better, to feel better, because I was in a circumstance with civil war and a lot of, lots of...
That was in Lebanon, wasn't it?
Yes, in Lebanon, there was a lot of pain and suffering and disease and problems, accidents and injuries and all of that. And it helped me to maintain my balance and be able to focus and continue my studies. And I was really looking to understand human behavior, to understand what can we do to make life better. And that's how I pursued it in some study of psychiatry and neurology, and then brain and cognitive science in the US. And I felt that I could contribute more through consciousness, through awareness. So I went to study with Maharishi Mahesh Yogi, and that was the path that fascinated me, and I see the results were really worth it.
Yeah, obviously. Do you see that there is? Do you see the possibility of a merging between science and spirituality today? That there is some kind of awakening happening in the scientific community and also in society at large? Are you optimistic in that respect?
Yeah, absolutely. I think science has done a tremendous work in uncovering the mechanics of action of things and forces. And more importantly, the understanding of the quantum mechanical level, the quantum field level, leading us to the ultimate objectivity, which is the unified field. And therefore, as Maharishi used to say, ultimate objectivity has come to meet with ultimate subjectivity. And that is, the self is one field, Vedantic understanding. And from physics, it meets it there. So science is meeting together. And this new paradigm that is presenting can actually explain a lot of phenomena that in science are felt to be conundrums or difficult to explain. And it unifies not only science and the physical reality, but also the existence, philosophy, ontology, the knowledge, and even ethics and behavior. Why should one do this or that? And are there underlying principles that are able to make us understand the do's and don'ts of life, the meaning of life, why there is suffering, etc. So it's putting together all of this. Science is wonderful, and it is meeting spirituality in a wonderful way too.
Tony, so where can people find your book and also TM if they're interested?
There is a site called tm.org, which has quite a references. There is a site that I have, it's called drtonynader.com, drtonynader.com. The book is available in many languages, and it's on as an ebook. Also, you can find it in all those who sell ebooks, and Kindle and Amazon and others. I have recorded it also myself as an audiobook. So it is available in Audible and other audio platforms and Amazon. And I've read it myself, so it was a joy to read it.
Great. Speaking about joy, it's been a true joy speaking with you today, Tony Nader. Thank you so much for being a guest here, and now keep up the light work that you're doing.
Thank you for having me. It's wonderful. Congratulations on your wonderful program.
Thank you.
Thank you.
If you like this video and other interviews and talks on Mind the Shift, please like, share, and subscribe. I appreciate all the support. And you can follow Mind the Shift on Facebook and Instagram. And you can follow me, Anders Bolling, on all the main social media and also on medium.com. Thank you.